When the music teacher made Whitney Houston stand in front of her music theory class that Tuesday morning in October 1979, nobody knew they were about to witness a moment that would change everything. What happened next didn't just prove a teacher wrong, it revealed the birth of a legend who would redefine what it means to have the voice. If you've ever been told you're not good enough, that your dreams are too big, or that you should stick to what's realistic, then Whitney's story will resonate with you in ways you never expected. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to discover about the voice will change how you understand true talent. It was October 16th, 1979, at Mount Vernon High School in New York. 16-year-old Whitney Houston sat in the middle row of Mrs. Patricia Williams's advanced music theory class. Trying to focus on the chord progressions written on the blackboard, Whitney had always been good at music. Growing up as the daughter of gospel legend Cissy Houston meant music was literally in her blood. But Mrs. Williams's class was different from the joyful, spirit-filled music Whitney knew from church. Mrs. Williams believed in classical training, proper technique, and traditional European musical standards. She had been teaching music theory at Mount Vernon High for 22 years, and she ran her classroom with the precision of a conservatory professor. In her world, music was about rules, structure, and staying within established boundaries. She had no patience for students who couldn't read complex musical notation, who relied on feeling rather than technical knowledge, or who thought they could improvise without understanding theory. And she especially had no patience for Whitney Houston. Whitney had made the mistake of mentioning during the first week of class that she sang solos at New Hope Baptist Church and had been performing backup vocals for her mother's recording sessions. Mrs. Williams had immediately pegged her as another teenager with delusions of grandeur, probably another church singer who thought emotional performance could substitute for real musical education. "Miss Houston," Mrs. Williams's sharp voice cut through the classroom that Tuesday morning, interrupting Whitney's attempt to quietly work through the harmony exercises. "I'd like you to come to the front of the class, please." Whitney's stomach dropped. She hadn't been talking, hadn't been disruptive. She'd been trying to solve the complex chord progression Mrs. Williams had assigned, using the gospel harmonies she'd learned from her mother to understand the classical structure. But when Mrs. Williams used that tone, "You didn't ask questions?" Whitney stood up, her heart already racing as 28 pairs of eyes turned to watch her. She walked to the front of the classroom, her platform shoes clicking on the linoleum floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. The other kids were already exchanging glances. Being singled out by Mrs. Williams was never good news. "Class," Mrs. Williams said, positioning herself next to Whitney with her arms crossed. "I want to use Miss Houston here as an example of something we've been discussing. The difference between genuine musical training and what some people mistake for talent." Whitney felt her face burn with embarrassment. She stared at the music stands in front of the class, wishing she could disappear into the floor. This was worse than any nightmare she'd ever had. "Miss Houston informed me at the beginning of this semester that she performs regularly at her church and has done some professional backup work," Mrs. Williams continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made every word feel final. "So I thought this would be an excellent opportunity for her to demonstrate for us." Whitney's head snapped up. Demonstrate what? She hadn't prepared anything. She didn't even know what Mrs. Williams wanted her to do. "I've asked Miss Houston to perform a piece that showcases what she believes to be her vocal ability," Mrs. Williams announced to the class. "This will help us understand the difference between trained musicianship and enthusiastic amateurism." The way she said enthusiastic amateurism made it clear what category she thought Whitney belonged in. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even they could sense this was about to get ugly. I don't have any music prepared, ma'am," Whitney said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, surely someone with your experience can sing something without preparation," Mrs. Williams replied, her tone dripping with false encouragement. "After all, if you're performing professionally, you must be comfortable singing a cappella. Choose anything you'd like, whatever you think best represents your abilities." Whitney could hear snickers from some of the students. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she felt that familiar tightness in her throat that came with extreme nervousness. But she'd been singing her whole life. She'd performed for thousands of people at church events, had sung backup for her mother in recording studios with some of the biggest names in R&B. She could do this. She had to do this. Whitney closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the classroom, the staring students, Mrs. Williams' expectant smirk. She thought about her mother's voice, about the way Cissy had taught her that singing wasn't just about hitting notes. It was about telling a story, about reaching people's hearts. She thought about the song that always made her feel connected to something bigger than herself. Whitney began to sing Amazing Grace, but not the way it was traditionally performed in white churches. She sang it the way she'd learned it from her mother, with the gospel runs and emotional intensity that made the song feel alive rather than merely pretty. Her voice started softly, almost conversationally, then built with each phrase, adding layers of harmony and improvisation that turned the familiar hymn into something entirely new. As Whitney sang, something magical happened that always occurred when she really let herself go. The classroom disappeared. Mrs. Williams disappeared. The fear disappeared. There was only the music, only the story she was telling through song, only the pure joy of letting her voice do what it was born to do. She added runs that would have made Aretha Franklin proud, sustained notes that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and emotional breaks that made the ancient words feel like they were being written for the first time. When she reached the final verse, her voice soared so high and pure that it seemed to fill not just the classroom, but the entire school. When Whitney finished, the classroom was completely silent. Even the students who had been ready to laugh were staring at her with their mouths open. For a moment, Whitney thought maybe she had done well. Maybe Mrs. Williams would finally understand that what she had wasn't just church enthusiasm. It was real, legitimate talent that deserved respect. Then Mrs. Williams started clapping, slowly, sarcastically. A few confused students nervously joined in, unsure of how they were supposed to react. "Thank you, Miss Houston, for that interesting interpretation," Mrs. Williams said, her voice cutting through the applause like ice. "Class, I want you to pay very close attention now, because Miss Houston has just provided us with a perfect example of several critical mistakes that aspiring singers make." Whitney stood frozen as Mrs. Williams began to circle her like she was a specimen being examined under a microscope. First, notice the complete disregard for proper vocal technique. No breath support, no attention to pitch accuracy in the elaborate runs, no understanding of how to protect the vocal instrument. What you just heard might sound impressive to untrained ears, but it's exactly the kind of singing that destroys voices within a few years. Each word hit Whitney like a physical blow. She kept her eyes fixed on the blackboard, blinking rapidly to keep tears from forming. Second, observe the excessive emotional display. In professional music, we control our emotions. We don't let them control us. What Miss Houston just demonstrated is the kind of self-indulgent performance that might work in certain cultural contexts, but has no place in serious musical settings. The pause before cultural context made it clear what Mrs. Williams really meant, and several of the black students in the class shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Third, and perhaps most importantly, notice the stylistic confusion. This is supposed to be a hymn, a piece of sacred music with centuries of tradition behind it. Miss Houston has taken it upon herself to completely reimagine this piece, adding elements that have no business being there. This shows a fundamental lack of respect for musical tradition and proper interpretation. Mrs. Williams stopped directly in front of Whitney, looking her in the eye with absolute certainty. "Miss Houston, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen very carefully. I've been teaching music for 22 years. I've seen hundreds of students come through these doors. Some have genuine talent and the discipline to develop it properly. Most do not." The classroom was dead silent now. Even the students who usually whispered through class seemed to understand they were witnessing something brutal. "You unfortunately fall into the second category," Mrs. Williams continued. "What you just demonstrated is not talent. It's untrained enthusiasm. It's the musical equivalent of screaming loudly and hoping someone mistakes volume for skill." Whitney finally looked up, meeting her teacher's eyes for the first time since the ordeal began. You have a naturally strong voice. I'll grant you that. But a strong voice without proper training is just noise. Performing at your church and doing backup work for family members is not a career. It's a hobby at best, a delusion at worst. Mrs. Williams's voice grew harder, more definitive, with each sentence. Your style is confused, your technique is non-existent, and your understanding of musical history and theory is clearly minimal. My advice to you is to give up on these musical fantasies now, before you waste years of your life chasing something you will never achieve. She paused for effect, letting the words sink in. You will never be a professional singer, Miss Houston. You simply don't have what it takes. The sooner you accept that reality, the better off you'll be. Mrs. Williams turned back to address the full class. Miss Houston has done us a service today by demonstrating what happens when raw emotion tries to substitute for proper training. She's shown us that confidence without competence is just arrogance, and that cultural performance styles, while they may have their place, are not suitable for serious musical study. She looked back at Whitney one final time. You may sit down now, Miss Houston, and please, let's focus on developing real musical skills rather than indulging in these theatrical displays. Whitney walked back to her desk feeling like she'd been physically assaulted. Her legs were shaking, and she could barely see through the tears she was fighting to hold back. The other students wouldn't look at her, some from embarrassment, others from anger at what they just witnessed. She sat down and stared at her music theory textbook for the rest of class, not hearing a single word Mrs. Williams said about chord progressions and harmonic analysis. The only thing echoing in her mind was that voice of absolute authority. You will never be a professional singer. You simply don't have what it takes. After class, Whitney didn't go to her next period. She walked straight to the payphone in the hallway and called her mother, Collect. Mama, Whitney said when Cissy answered, her voice breaking despite her efforts to stay strong. Can you come pick me up? Something happened at school. 30 minutes later, Cissy Houston walked into Mount Vernon High School. Like a woman on a mission, Whitney had told her the entire story during their phone conversation. And Cissy's famous temper, the one that had intimidated record executives and diva singers alike, was at full boiling point. Where is she? Cissy demanded when they reached the main office. Where is this teacher who thinks she can talk to my daughter like that? The principal, Dr. James Anderson, had already heard about the incident. News traveled fast in a high school, especially when it involved a student being publicly humiliated. He tried to mediate, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that Mrs. Williams was simply providing constructive criticism as part of her teaching method. Constructive criticism? Cissy's voice could have cut glass. Let me tell you about constructive criticism. I've worked with Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley, and Dionne Warwick. I know what real musical instruction looks like. What that woman did to my daughter wasn't teaching, it was destruction. Dr. Anderson promised to speak with Mrs. Williams about her classroom management techniques, but he also gently suggested that perhaps Whitney was being overly sensitive, that learning to accept criticism was part of growing as a performer. Overly sensitive? Cissy stood up from her chair, her full presence filling the small office. My daughter has been performing professionally since she was 11 years old. She sang backup on recording sessions that have sold millions of copies. She's not sensitive, she's talented. And that teacher is threatened by what she can't understand. Walking to Cissy's car after the meeting, Whitney felt both embarrassed and protected. Her mother's fierce defense meant everything to her, but it couldn't erase Mrs. Williams's words from her mind. Mama, Whitney said as they drove home through the familiar streets of East Orange, what if she's right? What if I'm just fooling myself about singing? Cissy pulled the car over and turned to face her daughter directly. Whitney Elizabeth Houston, let me tell you something your grandmother told me when I was starting out in this business. There are two kinds of people in music, those who feel it and those who think it. Mrs. Williams thinks music. You feel it, and feeling it is what makes people remember a song long after it's over. Whitney wanted to believe her mother, but Mrs. Williams had sounded so certain, so authoritative. But she's been teaching for 22 years, Mama. She knows about proper technique and she knows about one kind of music, Cissy interrupted. She knows about the kind of music that follows rules and stays in neat little boxes. But honey, the music that changes people's lives, that music breaks rules. That music comes from places that can't be taught in any classroom. Cissy took her daughter's hands. You know what you're going to do? You're going to prove her wrong, not because you want revenge, but because you want to show the world what real music sounds like. Every time you sing from now on, every time you perform, you're going to remember what that woman said, and you're going to use it as fuel to burn brighter. That night, Whitney lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened. Mrs. Williams' words kept echoing. You will never be a professional singer. But they were competing with her mother's words. Use it as fuel to burn brighter. The next day at school, Whitney walked past Mrs. Williams in the hallway. The teacher didn't acknowledge her, didn't even make eye contact. To Mrs. Williams, Whitney was just another deluded student who had been set straight. But Whitney looked at her teacher and made a silent promise. One day, Mrs. Williams would know her name. One day, the whole world would know her name. Whitney threw herself into performing with a new intensity after that day. Every gospel concert at New Hope Baptist, every recording session with her mother, every amateur night at local clubs, she sang with more passion, more determination, more fire than ever before. And every time someone told her she was gifted, every time an audience jumped to their feet, every time a producer asked for her phone number, Whitney thought about Mrs. Williams and thought, see, you were wrong. In 1981, when Whitney was discovered by a photographer while performing with her mother at a Manhattan nightclub, one of her first thoughts was about her music theory class. In 1983, when Clive Davis signed her to Arista Records after hearing just one song, Whitney wondered if Mrs. Williams had heard about the local girl who'd gotten a record deal in 1985. When her debut album went multi-platinum and produced 3 number-1 hits, Whitney was certain that Mrs. Williams must have seen her on television. But it wasn't until 1987, after Whitney had become the first artist to have 7 consecutive number-1 hits, that Mrs. Williams reached out. The letter arrived at Arista Records, forwarded through Whitney's management company. Mrs. Williams had seen Whitney's performance on the Grammy Awards, had watched her acceptance speech, had finally understood what she had failed to recognize in her classroom 8 years earlier. In the letter, Mrs. Williams apologized. She explained that she had been teaching the same classical methods for so long that she couldn't recognize talent that didn't fit her narrow definitions. She admitted that watching Whitney's success had taught her more about music than all her years of formal education. She asked if Whitney could ever forgive her for the things she had said that day. Whitney read the letter 3 times, then called her mother. "What do you think I should do?" Whitney asked. "What does your heart tell you?" Cissy replied, "That hurt people sometimes hurt other people, and that forgiveness is more powerful than anger." 2 weeks later, Whitney did something that surprised everyone. She went back to Mount Vernon High School and asked to speak with Mrs. Williams. The teacher, now grayer and looking smaller than Whitney remembered, agreed to meet in the same music room where the confrontation had taken place. Whitney stood in front of the classroom again, but this time as a Grammy-winning recording artist. Mrs. Williams sat at her desk, looking nervous and ashamed. "Mrs. Williams," Whitney said gently, "I got your letter. Miss Miss Whitney, I can't tell you how sorry I am. What I said to you was inexcusable. Please let me finish," Whitney said, her voice kind but firm. "I wanted to thank you." Mrs. Williams looked shocked. "Thank me?" "Yes, ma'am. What you did that day hurt me deeply. I went home thinking, maybe you were right. Maybe I should give up. But then I realized something. You gave me a choice. I could believe you, or I could prove you wrong. And choosing to prove you wrong made me work harder than I ever would have otherwise." Whitney smiled, the same radiant smile that had charmed millions of viewers on television. "Every time I wanted to quit during those early recording sessions, every time someone told me my sound was too R&B for pop radio or too pop for R&B radio, I thought about you telling me I'd never make it, and I thought, watch me." Mrs. Williams had tears in her eyes. "I was wrong about everything. Your technique, your style, your potential, everything." "You weren't entirely wrong," Whitney said thoughtfully. "I didn't have formal training. I was mixing gospel and pop in ways that probably didn't make sense to someone with a classical background. I was singing with more emotion than technical control. She sat down in one of the student desks, looking around the familiar room. But what you didn't understand was that those things weren't flaws. They were what made me different. They were what made people connect with my music. Mrs. Williams nodded, wiping her eyes. I've changed how I teach because of you. I tell my students now that there are many valid ways to express musical talent, not just the traditional European methods I was trained in. Whitney stood up to leave, then turned back one more time. Mrs. Williams, do you want to know the honest truth? That day in your class was one of the most important days of my life, not because you were right about my limitations, but because it taught me that other people's opinions of me don't define what I'm capable of achieving. She paused at the door. You taught me that I could either let someone else's narrow definition of talent limit me, or I could define talent for myself. I chose to define it for myself. I'm glad you did, Mrs. Williams said softly. The world is a more beautiful place because you didn't listen to me. Me too, Whitney replied. Me too. The story of Whitney and Mrs. Williams became legendary in music education circles. Mrs. Williams shared it with every new group of students as a cautionary tale about the danger of limiting definitions of talent and the importance of cultural sensitivity in music instruction. I once had a student who didn't fit any of my categories, she would tell her classes. She mixed gospel and pop in ways I thought were inappropriate. She sang with emotion I thought was excessive. She had a style I thought was undisciplined. Her name was Whitney Houston, and she taught me that the most important thing about music isn't following rules, it's moving people's hearts. Patricia Williams taught for another 8 years after meeting with Whitney. She completely transformed her curriculum, incorporating gospel, blues, jazz, and contemporary styles alongside classical training. She never forgot the lesson Whitney taught her, that sometimes the students we think will fail are actually the ones who change the world. Whitney kept Mrs. Williams's apology letter for the rest of her life, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even people who hurt us can learn and grow, and that grace is more powerful than grudges. The music teacher told Whitney she'd never be a professional singer. What Whitney did next wasn't just prove her wrong, it was show the world that talent can't be contained by anyone else's limitations. And maybe that's the most legendary thing of all. If this story of humiliation transformed into triumph inspired you, make sure to subscribe and share this video. Let us know in the comments if a teacher ever told you that you wouldn't succeed. Sometimes the best response to someone who doubts you isn't anger. It's grace, success, and the wisdom to help them understand what they missed.